Hey everybody, it's the History Teacher. This episode compares the beliefs, methods, and goals of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. Dr. King, who was a Baptist minister, believed in the equality of all people before God. He believed that racial segregation was destructive to the souls of both white and black people. Dr. King believed that discrimination against African Americans violated the basic principles of America, such as equality under the law and the right to pursue happiness. Dr. King's initial goal was to end segregation in the South. Dr. King studied and admired Mohandas Gandhi, the Indian leader whose use of nonviolent resistance was instrumental in securing India's liberation from British rule in 1947. With Gandhi's example in mind, Dr. King would practice nonviolent protest to achieve his goal. Dr. King did not prefer nonviolent resistance merely because he was a man of peace who abhorred violence. He favored nonviolent protest because he believed that using it would expose the severe violence that underpinned the system of segregation in the South, which was normally hidden. White Southerners would often claim that black people in the South were content with segregation, that the system was good for both races, and that black people appreciated it just as much as white people did. White Southerners would say that they didn't need to force black people to be separate from white people because both races preferred to be separate. In short, many white Southerners alleged that the South was a peaceful, stable place due to segregation, and that segregation wasn't a coercive system. Dr. King, however, was an African American from the South and knew that such claims were patently false. He believed that the best method to unmask segregation as a system of social terrorism was nonviolent resistance. Of course, Dr. King was proved correct. Protesters marching peacefully, even children, were attacked by police officers, police dogs, and blasted by fire hoses. Protesters conducting peaceful sit-ins at lunch counters were viciously assaulted by white Southerners, while white police officers merely observed. Protesters peacefully riding racially integrated buses were nearly killed by white mobs. Nonviolent resistance demonstrated to the whole world that the apparent tranquility of the segregated South only existed because black people had been subjugated by the fear and threat of violence. Put another way, white Southerners' claim that segregation brought peace to the South was shown to be true only because black people knew that they would be beaten or murdered if they resisted. Black people nonviolently protesting weren't physically fighting anyone. All they were doing was not going along with the system. They put their bodies in places where they didn't belong. And that's all it took for white Southerners to try to reinforce the racist social order through immediate and extreme violence. So, the goal of nonviolent protest was to provoke a brutal reaction by white racists in order to expose the cruelty of segregation and to shock northern white moderates, especially national leaders, into action. Dr. King advocated nonviolent protest not because he was a coward or even because he was a pacifist. He preferred nonviolent protest because it is a sophisticated technique that he was certain could end segregation. And he was right. By the end of 1965, after 10 years of civil rights activism, legal racial discrimination was prohibited, and African Americans' right to vote had been restored. Malcolm X was a minister in the Nation of Islam, which is a black nationalist version of Islam, founded by an American named Elijah Muhammad in 1930. As a minister, Malcolm persuasively preached the beliefs of the nation and converted tens of thousands of African Americans to the faith. Malcolm believed that white people were the devil, and that, for their own sake, African Americans should indeed be separate from white people. So, Malcolm wasn't opposed to racial segregation because he believed that white people should be kept as far away from black people as possible. Without the destructive influence of white people, Malcolm believed that African Americans could achieve their extraordinary potential. Malcolm argued that black people were not merely equal to white people, but better than white people. That is, Malcolm was a black supremacist. In all of these beliefs, Malcolm conformed to the principles of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm famously declared that black people would fight for respect and their rights, quote, by any means necessary, implying that violent opposition to racial discrimination was possible. Indeed, Malcolm was not a pacifist, and he criticized the nonviolent resistance practiced by Southern civil rights leaders like Dr. King. Malcolm referred to Dr. King's 1963 March on Washington as the farce on Washington. To Malcolm and his adherents, the notion of passively being beaten by white racists was repugnant, but just as Dr. King didn't necessarily use nonviolence because he was a pacifist, Malcolm didn't threaten violence because he was personally violent. Malcolm's reasoning was that fundamental change wouldn't result from African Americans calmly being attacked by dogs and police. Malcolm believed that for too long black people had been idle in the face of white racism. It was time to fight back. Malcolm believed that the history of America made it clear that white people wouldn't be persuaded by words or peaceful protests, but only by the threat of a strong revolt by frustrated and angry black people who were tired of living on the margins of America. Malcolm didn't trust white people. He believed that if African Americans were to improve their lives, they needed to do it on their own and as far away from white people as possible. And yet, despite his provocative rhetoric, which was often infused with violent implications, it's important to note that Malcolm never actually incited violence, nor participated in any violent protests. In his actions, if not his words, Malcolm was just as much of a man of peace as Dr. King was. Toward the end of their lives, the thinking of both Malcolm and Dr. King changed. After helping to attain the right to vote and desegregation, Dr. King focused on economic justice and an end to the U.S. war in Vietnam. Dr. King understood that the right to vote and to sit in the front of the bus would have limited benefit for African Americans who were homeless, unemployed, and poor. And the wealth gap between white people and racial minorities meant that soldiers fighting in Vietnam were disproportionately people of color. White people who had more money could more easily afford college and thus obtain a deferment from the draft. At the end of his life, Dr. King's next goal was to organize poor people of all races to pressure the government to act quicker and more effectively to end poverty in the richest country on earth. Malcolm's beliefs were transformed in the last year of his life. In 1964, he made a pilgrimage to Mecca in Saudi Arabia, the holiest site in Islam. While there, he saw light-skinned people worshiping with black people in peace and brotherhood. This experience induced Malcolm to convert from the Nation of Islam to authentic Islam, which Malcolm believed held the promise to end racism. After his return from Mecca, Malcolm no longer talked about white devils, the benefits of racial separation, or violence as a justifiable means to achieve goals. Indeed, Malcolm strongly repudiated the Nation of Islam, and especially its founder, Elijah Muhammad. The bitter break between Malcolm and the Nation resulted in Malcolm's assassination, widely considered to have been ordered by Elijah Muhammad. Dr. King and Malcolm X only met one time, and briefly. Despite their differences, their ultimate belief and goal was the same, that black people in America ought to be treated as human beings, and that the system as it existed could not be tolerated by people of conscience and faith. Neither Dr. King nor Malcolm X are solely responsible for the accomplishments of the civil rights movement. Dr. King didn't invent nonviolent resistance, nor did Malcolm X invent black nationalism. The impact of both of these men was dependent on the commitment, sacrifice, and courage of hundreds of thousands of men and women. However, their lives testify to the influence of individuals in shaping history. Okay, that does it for now. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.